All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today for this week's installment of the Ultrasound Lecture Series. I'm really excited today. We have a special guest. I've invited Jason Nomura to join us today. Jason is the director of ultrasound, point of care ultrasound for the Department of Emergency Medicine over at ChristianaCare, as well as the system-wide POCUS director out at ChristianaCare. And I've bumped into Jason from time to time at conferences over the years where he's always speaking about different topics of ultrasound. And so he is a wealth of knowledge about ultrasound. And the reason why I asked him to join today is he gave a really excellent presentation this last year at AIUM about the use of handheld ultrasound. This is kind of the new thing that is kind of hitting the point of care space right now is handheld ultrasounds, and what do we do with all these different vendors and the different devices that are coming on the market, and kind of the possibilities that it opens up, as well as some of the challenges that it affords us. And so to that end, I'm not going to take up Jason's time. I'm excited to hear kind of what he has to present to us and kind of how we can help use that knowledge to incorporate that knowledge into our own deployment of our handheld ultrasounds here at Metro. So, Jason, without further ado, go ahead and take it away and see what you have to say.
All right, let me see about sharing the screen. See if this works. All right, you guys can see the slideshow okay?
Yes, sir.
All right. So like Matt was saying, this is based on the talk I gave over at AIUM. So I sort of wanted to review some of the information for you guys, and we'll go through the slides, and then we'll have a lot of time for discussion and questions. And because part of what happens is there's some general information and some general topics, but some of it really comes down to specifics at your institution with the equipment, the providers, and the setup and everything else. So I think sometimes when there's questions, there's no way to address all of them in a general talk. So, like Matt said, I'm the medical director for system-wide point-of-care ultrasound at Christiana and the director of our emergency medicine ultrasound. As a disclosure, I've received some consultant fees from Philips for interviews and stuff, which have no impact on our discussion today.
This is leaking, but a lot all over his desk. Can you help me? Do we have any questions?
So, one of the questions I was asked to sort of address at the AIUM talk was, are handhelds ready to replace our cart-based systems? And really focusing on the point of care community, both from critical care, emergency medicine, and all of our other specialties that are starting to use point of care ultrasound. And part of it was thinking about whether it can replace it. You start thinking about things like hardware. And as we start to think about the hardware, we start thinking about the different devices that we have in use at our hospital, but also what we've seen on the market, whether it's by commercials and ads, or back when we used to have conferences, when you're going around the exhibit floor and seeing all these different vendors or whatever their new product is or their up and coming product or all their different handheld solutions. And most companies have had something in the handheld market in some format or another that you've probably been able to see over the last several years. But if we take a step back and think about it, the probe construction, so our traditional cart-based systems use what are called piezoelectric crystals, which are usually a lead zirconate titanate. It's a synthetic crystal rather than the old natural crystals, but they're pretty expensive and they're complex to manufacture. They're also hard to maintain, right? Because you drop them, crystals fracture, connections fracture, and that's part of why you can't autoclave probes, because the heat will just destroy the alignment of crystals and your entire probe's useless after that. So these are why our probes are so expensive, why they're thousands of dollars to manufacture, and why they break so easily every time we drop them and then have to be replaced. And then when we look at some of the handheld devices, they are the PZT crystals, but there's also a subset of them that are coming on. And as you can recognize from the image, probably the most famous vendor uses what's called capacitive machine ultrasound transducers, or CMUT transducers. And that's sort of what we think a lot about now for handheld because of the great marketing that this company's done, the ubiquity and the low cost price. But they're not really the first one. So this technology has been around since the 90s. And if you look in some of the clinical engineering and bioengineering literature, there's been a variety of different transducers that are being researched and made and different things like that. This is the one that's made it to market and has much more applications. And we're seeing them in different things, not just the handheld ultrasounds, but you'll see it on some of the cart-based systems. And you can see some of the vendors here that have used the technology for things, whether it's special intravascular probes or the handheld probes or different things that they may be using because the price is much lower. So some of them have gone into some of the disposable things like the intravascular catheters on some vendors. So the technology is out there, and it's not just one company that's sort of going out there with it, but they've done a really good job of mass production and cheap price and being able to make it applicable to a wider audience for us. But when you think about the images and the things we get worried about and the things we all get concerned about as imagers, is that when we're looking at our different machines and we're looking at the images, our concern is always how well is the image quality going to be with something like the CMUT process versus a regular PZT crystal. And to be honest, when you look at these images, in the middle is a CMUT system, and on either side are different point of care systems that use traditional PZT crystals. And I'll be honest, like some of the image quality is great, but when you start talking about image quality, one of the things that people get picky about is how the image looks, what the soft tissue looks like, how black are the blacks, how gray are the grays, how white are the whites. And a lot of that is not just the crystal and the transducer itself, but it's also the software package. So some of that is just the vendor specific software processing. So like our cardiologists are really into Philips cardiac processing. They don't like some of the other systems. Some of our radiologists really like Canon soft tissue processing, or, you know, someone likes the liver processing on this system versus that. So there's a lot that goes into it that is not just the hardware and the probe. So that software also makes a big difference. And that's something to take in consideration when you're looking at different handheld products and who's manufacturing them and what your image quality looks like. And then the other part is that some of these handhelds run on devices, whether it's Android or iOS devices, but these personal devices. So when you take those images from the probe and then run the software to do this, we're looking at computational power. And we have this big Cartbased system, and we have this huge system that has great processing power and can run all these algorithms and stuff to take that image, make it all pretty, and make it look much better than we used to have with the old systems before, when it was all like circuit boards and everything else rather than processors on chips. And if you think about it, we're probably not running our ultrasound machines on the latest processors, right? Like if you look at that, like the AMD processor at 3.4 gigahertz, that's probably not what's in our ultrasound machine, right? Because they're probably not buying the top of the line processor that you're going to use for gaming or a high-end computer. They're going to be several layers lower. And if you then also think about it, when you bought that ultrasound machine, you're not upgrading it on a yearly or 2-year cycle like you do your iPads and Android tablets or your phones. It's a much longer time frame, right? Average warranty is about 5 years. So even if you're only going on a warranty cycle, which is a really short cycle for some of these medical devices, you're looking at a processor that could be 3 to 5 years old. So, right, like the AMD 3.4 gigahertz, great processor, right? It has these wonderful processing powers. But then if you pull apart some of the specs in the clinical engineering, like one of our cart-based ultrasound systems using the i7 chip, so we're several steps way below top of the line. And then if you look at your iPhones, and if you look at your iPhones that could be used with some of the with the butterfly system because of how it's constructed, you can see that the processing power is pretty good. And if you go back 2 generations, it's also not that much worse than, say, the i7 chip that's in some of our cart-based systems that were manufactured a couple of years ago. At least when you start to think about it on the surface. But then when you dig into there, the Androids are also doing pretty well too, right? So whether it's an Android-based system like from Philips or it's an iOS system like from Butterfly, the handheld device has the processing power to kind of keep up. And the part that's a little misleading, like if you look at the i7 chip, the actual i7 chip that's in one of our cart-based systems, the model, it's not that great, right? It's not the top of the line i7 that we have in some of our desktops and our laptops. It's a industry i7 that's kind of produced for the ultrasound manufacturers and modified. So if you look at the kind of close there, they're running at a single core score in the 600s or even sometimes down to 300s, right? So single threaded function, you're looking at 500 to 600, whereas you're maybe hitting 1,000. But then if you look at your iPhone, the iPhone is calculating way higher than that. So the handheld hardware can be capable to do all of this. When you look at both the hardware of your handheld device and the hardware of the probe itself to create that image to then be processed. And so the hardware can perform. And there's also another few things that come up with the hardware that you have to think about that becomes a little more complicated than when we think about our traditional cart-based systems, because the traditional cart-based system is sort of all packaged together, right? We have to think about, do we want wired probes? Are we looking at a wireless probe solution? Is there transmission via wire transmission? Is there a dock that has to be hardwired into our system? What is the compression of those images like? Because it may look really great when we're acquiring it, but then when we put it in our PAC system, how much is that image compressed and how well does it appear 3 days later when that patient's having a change or a repeat study? And also the size and ergonomics. Is this something that's easily used and easily transported, or is it going to be a little bit cumbersome for users? So coming back to the question about handhelds being ready to replace cart-based systems, and it becomes a little more complex issue. And my answer is always no. I don't think we can replace our cart-based systems with the handheld systems. And I partially think that that's because when you look at your ultrasound systems, like if you look at this lineup of potential ultrasound systems that are cart-based from one manufacturer, all the way on the far right, you have a touch interface, very slim design for point of care use. And then you have the intermediate model, and then you have the flagship large cart-based system for radiology. And right, they're all three are cart-based systems, but they're very different and very different uses. So are you talking about replacing the radiology system, the intermediate version, or the slimmed down point of care system? And I don't think it's really something that you can say ubiquitously, we're going to replace our cart-based systems, right? Just like when point of care ultrasound and emergency medicine first started, we're using something like the Sonosite 180 because that was the only device available on the market. It was either that or I go to radiology and try and use the Sequoia, right? So the question was never, can my little portable ultrasound at that time replace the Sequoia in radiology? It was always, what can I use the point of care system for that either I can't use the radiology system for something like ultrasound guided procedures in the setting of a crashing patient, or it's unwieldy or not the right equipment for what I want to do in that setting. And then, so here's another view where you have something like the Lumify handheld system, which is a Android-based device. They also have an iOS product. But if you look at that, is that going to replace my Spark? Or are we looking at that replacing the IU series, right? Because talking about using a Lumify and a handheld system in place of a Spark is one thing. Talking about using that in place of the IU series and the Echo Lab is a whole different conversation. So talking about replacing cart-based systems, I think, is sort of a wrong question here. And we need to think about where where the right equipment is going to be used for the right purpose. Just like here for transcranial Doppler, if we're doing monitoring, which we don't necessarily do very often in emergency medicine, but can happen in vascular and neuroimaging and the neurology services, right? Like if I'm going to monitor that person's MCA for embolic phenomenon, do I want to stand there for half an hour holding a phased array probe on the side of their head? Probably not. Get tired. But the other option is using a head frame with a directional probe, and then you can monitor, and then you're not really holding it there for the time, and you're not really causing all that repetitive stress on the user, but making sure you have the right equipment for the right reason, right? They both serve the good purpose, but in different situations, you're going to need different things. I'm not going to want to use a head frame for a spot check for subarachnoid hemorrhage and vasospasm, but I'm also not going to want to hold a transcranial Doppler to their head for half an hour for monitoring. So I think the better question is, can handhelds be part of my ultrasound ecosystem? Can I incorporate the handhelds into my fleet and my equipment and make use of it in my clinical setting? Or as it was mentioned, can it be the ecosystem, right? Rather than the ecosystem. But I think it's more how we can incorporate it. So when we think about incorporating it, one of the things we have to think about is in our situation, what is going to be our areas that we need it? What's going to be our utilization? For us, one of the things we were thinking about was, can we use handheld ultrasound for vascular access, for our vascular access teams, which would include physicians, APPs, and nursing, a heavy amount with our IV team. And that would be something a little bit cheaper and easier to use, right? Because I need it for vascular access with the vascular access team, but I don't necessarily need it to be able to do an echo. And so the price points are also very different. But you also have to think about it. Like here, we have this biplane imaging, which is great for vascular access and very helpful. But if I'm doing something like a central line, right, I'm holding the probe, I'm driving the needle, I don't have a free hand to hold the tablet or the iPhone or the Android phone to be able to do my scanning. So then at that point, what am I doing? Am I setting it up on a procedure table? Am I having a second user there holding it up for me so I can view the screen? Or am I going to use a clamp system and mount it to a pole? And if I'm mounting it to a pole, like an IV pole or anything else, and I'm rolling around like that, or I'm purchasing the vendor's pole to sort of have this mounted thing, I'm basically converting this handheld into a cart-based system, which is okay, because is your goal to have a cheaper and easier to use cart-based system for limited use, or are you trying to have it handheld? Because if you're trying to have it handheld, it depends on what you're trying to do with it. If you're trying to get a cheaper cart-based system to be able to do a specific niche field and fill a need, that's fine. I think it just sort of depends on what you want to get done and will the equipment actually meet your needs without adding extraneous steps. Right. The other area we always focus on is unstable patients. Can I get to my unstable patient with the ultrasound to diagnose what I need to do, like pericardial fusion with tamponade, right? Getting there with a handheld system is much easier than getting there with a cart-based system. Or if I'm in trauma and I have CPR, or I have a post-operative patient and we have pericardial clot, or during CPR and we have asystole, like, can I get there easily? And part of that is the deployment and the logistics. And it's a great tool for handheld, but if you think about the deployment, here's a little map of what my emergency department looks like on our old tracker system. And then if I then go and think, well, can I get them in there? And then if I have cart-based systems in multiple areas physically throughout the department, does having a handheld system actually save me any time to get to that patient's bedside versus getting there with the cart-based system, which is already deployed into that core and right there? If we're talking about going through a location AD, that may not be helpful. But if we're talking about the code blue response and the rapid response team, who then has to cover 5 towers and 6 floors on each tower, getting a cart-based system in every unit is not financially feasible. Wheeling a cart-based system as you're running to the code is also a little more difficult. But if you have a handheld system and you're getting to that very area where the patient is unstable, that becomes a very different discussion than in a closed unit like the ED or the ICU. And then if you think even further, like about into field deployment, where you're talking about going throughout the entire city or the entire county, getting a system out there may be a lot more difficult, especially with the limited space on some of our ambulances and our transport vehicles. In that case, handhelds may serve an even better role in those areas. And some of that work's been done and looked at for military. Here they have a clamshell system, but they're already starting to use handheld systems in some of their deployment teams on different military services. And so this broadens where you can deploy these machines and how often you can use them and what you can also use them for. Even so much so that it made, like, the New York Times, right? That in certain areas with low resources, ultrasound's getting out there and being able to be used in areas that there was no medical imaging and no availability of technology for this purpose. And now we have that ability. And part of that is because of the handhelds, both from price, portability, and ease of access. And then just like if we're talking about global health, there's also things like disaster response, right? Because it's not just the capacity building in global health, but also when we have disaster or urgent disaster responses. And for all of us, the most recent disaster response we're all familiar with is the COVID crisis. So when we talk about resources in limited areas, it's not just going internationally, it's also during our overwhelming surge during COVID. And in some areas, like if you look here at Renown Health, they had to convert certain areas into their COVID cores and their COVID inpatient units. So this is a very limited resource area because it was not a patient care area to begin with, and it had to be converted. And somewhere like there, both from a cleaning standpoint, from a deployment standpoint, and just from a portability standpoint, that's where, where did my screen go? Screen just went to sleep for a little bit, sorry. In that setting, the handheld ultrasounds can make a huge difference. And that's where it's really come to the forefront in a lot of discussions, I think, in emergency medicine, hospital medicine, and critical care. So if you look at that area, trying to get my cart-based system in there, like if I'm in a tent out in the parking lot across the ED, do I even have wireless connection? Do I have power? Am I able to wheel it over all those speed bumps and through those potholes to get to that area? Or can I just walk out there with a phone and a probe and be able to take care of patients? And then that sort of gets us to how are we going to deploy something if we decide to have a handheld system? Because there's many things on the market, right? When you look at that hardware, are we going to have something that is a hardwired thing where the probe and the display device provided by the manufacturer are one item? So one thing breaks, both has to be replaced. The whole unit goes down and gets shipped in for replacement. Is it going to be one locked unit? Which also means that I have less concerns about them being separated and losing one over the other. Or do we use a probe with a proprietary display device, in which case it's easier to separate the two. So if one breaks, I can get one replaced and repaired while the other part still functions. But these are going to be a little more expensive because they're proprietary devices. So, as a medical device, those display items are going to be a little more expensive. They are going to be a little more rugged and probably a little more durable than some of the consumer products. Or do we go to a non-proprietary device with software where I can just load the software, do the scanning with the probe, and have that non-proprietary device, which is a consumer level, probably much easier to replace and harder to maintain because it's a little more fragile. And then you're also now responsible for all the software updates for the operating system for that. And the other version is the one we've all seen, the company that shall remain unnamed for CME purposes. But we all know, right? We can do it on either consumer devices that are Android or iOS operating system based. And then when we're looking at these devices and we're talking about whether it's going to be the personally owned or hospital owned, if it's hospital owned, there's an added level of complexity there, right? Because who handles that device? Do we have one device that goes from person to person? So the lead doc in the emergency department hands it off to the relief, or does everybody just kind of wander through and pick up a device and then log in? And then if we have multiple devices, are the devices being charged and how are they being charged? Do we have to have multi-charging stations with multiple devices so that there's always a few that are fully charged? If we're handing off devices, how do we charge them in between uses? And there becomes this level of complexity when it becomes hospital owned. If it's personally owned, you're responsible for charging your own device, and hopefully you did, but that's also a little level of complexity, but more on a personal level. And this is one of the things that worry me a little bit with personally owned devices, is that we all have friends and we all see iPhones and Android phones and all these different devices that have small cracks in them. And then we also have friends who have this shattered screen. And, I can read email on that. I can surf the web, but can I actually pick out the subtle pathology on that? Am I going to be able to see that small gallstone with shadowing? Am I going to be able to see the needle tip very well or see the small pericardial effusion? And to be honest, on some of the iPhones that I've seen and some of my partners, I don't know if I'd be able to pick up the pathology based on how damaged the screen is. And also, are they willing to stay on an upgrade cycle that will allow them to remain on the iOS, right? If it's a 7-year-old phone, it may not even be able to power that probe and run the software to do scanning. And then if it's a personal device, there's always a concern about contamination. It's still there if it's a hospital-owned device, but then it's a little easier to clean it with whatever you want, because if it gets damaged, it's not really that person's personal device. They're not as concerned about it. But you can see that here, there were a large amount of infection risk and infection studies done on personal mobile devices. And these are all different studies that were in this newsletter looking at that. And it's terrible. It's a great fomite, but you have to clean it very well. And if it's a personal device, and you're mandating someone clean their personal device with a specific type of disinfection regimen, is that compatible with the device? And if there's any damage, what's our responsibility as a system that has required them to do that? And remember, this was all data pre-COVID. So this is much worse after COVID and changes the type of disinfection and level of disinfection that you're going to be using. And then the thing that always gets the hospital system worried is the security related to personal and equipment devices, right? So here's a screenshot. Like if I have my personal device that logs into our secure system, there's multiple configurations and applications that are running in the background for the hospital to be able to secure that information and make sure it's HIPAA compliant, and also being able to wipe that device if it gets lost, which I think is important from a personal device that's accessing hospital systems. But are people willing to install that? We have several providers that do not want this information installed on their personal device. They're willing to run it on, they're willing to pick up a hospital device for their shift to use it. But, are people going to allow hospital control of their device for security? And that's always a big question. And that varies by person to person, and also the software you're using and how much battery life it impacts and everything else. The physical security also becomes a problem because if you have a handheld device, they're much more easily lost, stolen, or misplaced. So can you track that device, not just the display device, the phone or the tablet, but can you track the probe and know where it is physically? We have tracking devices on our cart-based system so we can find them in case they end up in a corner somewhere, or they get moved to the hallway, or they end up in clinical engineering because we had a repair. So we know that it's missing because it's being fixed, not because somebody misplaced it or took it to another unit. But deploying that on all of the handheld devices becomes a little more complex and a little larger lift, and then also figuring out where they are and then reclaiming them. And then that's great in the hospital, but once it leaves the hospital, can you actually track where that probe went until it's used again? Or track the device again until it's used? You may be able to wipe that device, but you may never get it back. And one of the things that comes up sometimes with the handheld systems is, and with our cart-based systems, is the patient information. So if I do a study, how do I get that patient information on that study so that I can reconcile it with their medical records so that information's available, but also so when there's a repeat study or a problem down the line, we can go back and figure it out. And even more so when there's quality assurance issues. So when there's a missed topic, or there's a pericardial effusion that was recognized, but not the loculations and the fibrinoid deposition within that pericardial effusion. So if you're reviewing these studies and there's errors in diagnosis or errors in findings, how do we go back into quality assurance if we don't know who the patient was or what the encounter was like to review the medical record? Because maybe it was recognized, it just wasn't documented in the QA system or the ultrasound images, but it was documented in the medical record. So that information was known and patient care was appropriate. But without those identifiers, quality assurance becomes very difficult to go back and ensure quality patient care. And then if we're going to be storing on PAC systems, that always comes up, can we export in DICOM to the PAC system so that we have a standardized format? And then if we do, is there an expense to that? Because is that an additional software package? Or can my PAC system actually display and archive whatever output from that point of care system was? And so there's a little bit of back and forth there, which kind of depends on your hospital and what your PAC system is and what the devices are. And there's going to be expenses, right? I generally have to pay extra for a DICOM package. Right? It's an add-on, and we don't think twice about it on our cart-based system, but that may be something to think about for the handheld systems that may or may not be sending DICOM. And all these additional expenses that will come up, right? The real world side is it's very cheap, but then I'm buying the device. Now I have to buy the probe. What about the warranty? What about the software? Do I have to get a license for each individual? Can I get an enterprise license? And what add-ons such as DICOM or wireless transmission do I have to add? Then what about the charging stations? What about the batteries? What about tracking and device management? And if I have software device management, do I need additional IT resources to set that up and maintain that? So there's a lot of additional real-world costs that come in beyond just the probe itself that we have to think about and make a case for. Right? So if I have a hospital-owned device for multiple users, and this is one of our charging stations, which, you know, because it gets abused a little bit, it gets a little messy. So you're going to have to replace things, right? So, you know, I have to have the power strip, I have to have the multi-charger unit, I have to have the cables, I have to potentially have a protective case. And in this case, a protective case with additional battery power. And then if I have a case with battery power, can I actually run the probe off of that or not? And so that becomes a lot more complex and a little bit of testing and figuring out what the best deployment strategy is for an institution. And then if we think about coding and billing, it gets a little complex there, because does the hospital own the probe? Does the hospital own the device that displays the images? Does it own both? And can I use facility fees if the hospital only owns a probe? Do I have to own both? And it's a big gray area that we don't have great answers for right now. What we do know is if both the probe and the device are personally owned, there's no facility fees because it's not owned by the hospital. And then in that case, can I reconcile the patient information to be able to even archive it, to be able to move to the step of CPT coding and billing? And for outcomes, maybe you have to think about what your outcomes are going to be. And you have to think maybe revenue isn't a great marker of outcome. Maybe number of scans done and coded and billed is not the metric you want. Is it just risk reduction? Is it providing care during the pandemic or other surge events, or reduction revenue loss in other areas? Because maybe having the handheld system lets you care for that critical patient, and it's that risk reduction and improvement in patient care, and the coding and billing on that isn't the win. It's the patient care. Maybe it's the providing pandemic care so that you have a deployable unit to your overflow area. Maybe that's the win. Or, maybe it's for vascular access, so you're not using the larger system, which costs more, and it's a reduction in revenue loss or expenses. So it's just sort of planning out what outcomes you're interested in that makes sense for the deployment and the use of the handhelds in your system. And importantly, thinking about what need you're filling. Like, what are you going to do with this handheld that fills a need? Is it just something extra, or is it going to make a difference and change something that you're doing and allow you to do more? And if that needs being filled and there's a marker of success, then I think it's worth deploying and adding to your system. But if there's not really a need that needs to be filled, or there's not a feasible way to have a win and a good outcome that shows the benefit of the technology, do you really need it in place? And is it really worth the lift of incorporating it into your system? And I think that becomes a very personal issue for each hospital and each system, whether it makes a difference for them or not. And that's most of what I have. And part of what we wanted to do was have this short discussion and go over these topics and things, and then have time for questions and answers and discussion where I think we can talk about the different issues that are a little more important on a institution level for you, and questions I can answer or go through.